let's move on to another team because I want to talk to Chris about another quarterback. One who you definitely fell in love with way long ago before Andrew Luck, and that's the Jacksonville Jaguars. We're going to talk about Blake Bortles, Chris. I know how much you love him.
Well, I was never in love, so we're good.
Well, here's the thing. We had you on last year, and you talked about Blake Bortles right after the season last year about how you thought that was not who he really was, and boy, were you ever right. I mean, you couldn't have been more right, in fact. Looking at Blake Bortles' numbers from this past season, 23 touchdowns, 16 interceptions from the previous season where he threw for 35 touchdowns. I mean, that's huge. I mean, yeah, I don't – it's a loss of words for me how much of a discrepancy that is between seasons. And because of that, Allen Robinson suffered as well. I mean, you look at his numbers, they're even more dumbfounded. I mean, 1,400 yards the season before, 14 touchdowns to 883 yards and 6 touchdowns. So my question to you, Chris, is there a chance this offense could get back on pace, or is this who they really are?
This is who they really are because that's who Blake Bortles really is. They're just this is why top-line numbers are not a good indicator. That's why, like, when I'm talking with Chris, I'm like, okay, I understand what Luck's numbers say, but tell me because you've watched him, right? And so then we sort of feel like we're burrowing towards something that's a little realer. And I feel the same way about Bortles. It's just if you watched that season where he threw all those touchdowns and for all those yards, you never were left feeling like he was a good player. That he was constantly screwing up in the first half, being down 3 touchdowns, and then having to throw in garbage time to rack up some empty calorie stats. His mechanics are terrible. He is a really good athlete, sort of an underrated runner, and it hasn't really manifested itself in great, consistent rushing yard totals or rushing touchdowns. But because he's a good athlete, he gets himself in crazy – moves his body around in the pocket, out of the pocket, and gets himself in crazy throwing situations and just doesn't have the mechanics to readjust his body on the fly and make an accurate throw. He's all over the place, and he's not going to be the starter of Jacksonville after this year.
So do you think that Allen Robinson then, for next season, with Blake Bortles most likely being the starter unless they draft somebody, which is it's too soon to say at this point, but do you think Allen Robinson then is more like a wide receiver 2 than a wide receiver 1?
Definitely. There's too many good wide receiver 1s. There's too many good wide receivers in the league who are as talented as Allen Robinson, and he's really talented, but just find themselves in better situations. He still scored 6 touchdowns, so he still helped you here and there, but 6 is, it wasn't 14, and the yardage is way down. Listen, I was really down on Blake Bortles, and I wasn't down on Allen Robinson. I figured there's a way for him to – there is. We've seen it plenty of times when there's a bad quarter. Jay Cutler used to lead Brandon Marshall and Alshon Jeffrey to lovely seasons while sucking himself, right? So it's very possible for a bad quarterback to still have a very good fantasy wide receiver. I was too high on Robinson last year, and I'm not going to make that mistake again. I think he might have been my wide receiver 7 or 8 or something like that. And it's just not going it's not going to happen next year because I've seen how bad it can get. If Blake Bortles plays like Blake Bortles, it can get really bad. Allen Robinson probably bounces back. It was probably a little bit unlucky. So there's obviously just some year-to-year variance, but the 2015 was fraudulent. It wasn't a real year.
Well, here's a stat line I'd like to give you guys here. What was interesting that I looked up was that you look at completions for 20-plus yard passes for Allen Robinson. In 2015, he had 31. In 2016, he had 11. I mean, they were just not throwing deep. That seemed to be one of the biggest differences between the seasons is that, with Allen Robinson being so good down the stretch, I mean, they just were not getting him deep enough to get the ball down to where he could, get separation.
Again, your top line numbers there are just telling you the wrong story. Right. They're telling you the story that, wow, things were really humming in 2015. And that was a deep strike, aggressive, really taking advantage of your wide receivers, super disciplined, like well-oiled machine. And in fact, it was a cluster bleep and they were losing every game by 1 million points. And so they just were sort of wildly throwing and Allen Robinson would bail out Blake Bortles time and time a bad throw that he'd somehow catch again and again and again. And then, so that was probably artificially high. And then, we'll say last year was probably just unlucky. He makes a couple of other catches that are longer, then we don't see that number, and he gets over 1,000 yards, and we're not. It's the comparison statistically isn't as stark. Blake Bortles didn't play that differently from 2015 to 2016. He just really didn't. If you watch him on film, he's bad. He's really bad.
Mm-hmm.